Hello and welcome to the DM's Book Club, a podcast where we read about some Dungeons & Dragons and discuss how we might include it in our role-playing campaigns. But that's completely different to what we're doing today, so that's all good. With joining me today is special guest Chris. Chris, how are you?
I'm good. I'm slightly tired after a long day of meetings and decorating a room for the last week on and off. Also writing lots of things.
Yeah, you are probably the busiest man I know. It's always every time we finish a role playing session, you're like, yes, I now have to write, and you're like, but it's like 11 o'clock at night. And yes, I do appreciate I'm asking you to record this on a Monday as well.
That's okay. It's actually mostly the best time to get to do such a thing.
Well, I'm glad to have you here for sure, but maybe later on you're like, oh, energy drain. How did you get into role-playing games then?
Oh wow. Okay, that's
let's warm you up with that question.
Yeah. So tabletop gaming for me began with wargaming. So a friend of mine got back in 1990. Must have been Christmas 1994. He got Warhammer 40,000 Second Ed. Obviously, that's a war game, and so I was collecting stuff for that and other Games Workshop games. And then one random weekend, my parents came back and like, oh, we got this and you thought you might like it. And so it was the classic D&D Black Box Red Dragon edition. I think it's like counts as like the 18th edition of it or something like that. It's you can work out which printing it is.
Yeah.
Oh god, I can't remember what the scenario is. It's like some nonsense. But yeah, that's where I got started with it. And classic D&D, of course, is very basic. You know, you got Thaco in there, and you know, you're either a wizard or an elf or a fighter. There's nothing
else.
There's no like species, race, ancestry choice followed by class. You're just you're an elf, so you can do magic. So it was very much trying to emulate. I guess it emulates as much as it can Tolkien-esque tropes in fantasy. And then after that, so you know, you run that and you push as far as you can with what's in that core book. Yeah. And then it was on to like Star Wars 2nd edition revised that I think was in Arcane, advertised in Arcane magazine that year, which is a D6 dice pool system by West End Games, which is a classic. It's a classic book because so much. I mean, that's an important roleplay game because so much of the Star Wars expanded universe was developed through that roleplay game. Those are the main games for a bit, and then I spotted in Arcane magazine, which was a classic UK publication, and it's a shame we don't have things like that. Well, we kind of do. There are some other magazines, I guess, these days. What was it? It would have been now 1996 or so, and it was the top 50 RPGs of all time, according to Arcane magazine. And number one was Call of Cthulhu. Number 2 was D&D, or Advanced D&D. And then number 3 was Vampire the Masquerade. So I then was like, I'll pick up a copy of Vampire the Masquerade.
Yes. Which
has obviously influenced everything. I've done since then. So that's where I kind of got started in RPGs. You know, I've played World of Darkness games. I've played, too much Games Workshop stuff. You know, Necromunda and Inquisitor, though their war games are heavy roleplay game aspects to them. And then, since then it's been, got into podcasting. So it was when I was it was after my PhD. There was a podcast that started up called Darker Days Radio. And,
oh yes, I've heard of that one.
Yeah. And so me and Mike, who co-hosts with me, we were on the forums for that podcast where it started up, and then we were on to the forums that the podcast had. And these days you don't have forums because you got Discord.
Oh, yeah.
And we basically submitted some stuff to it, or recorded small segments, or were like, oh, do you want to just come on and talk about this? And that was like basically how both of us kind of just got roped in. And since then, you know, after the first year or so, one of the original hosts disappeared, left it because of their reasons. And then Mark Hope was with us for a year or so, and then it's just been me and Mike for like the last 10 years, which 10
years, bloody hell.
Over 10 years. Well, Darker Days Radio has been going now for like 12 plus years, and we've been hosting it for 10 years, and we don't do an episode every week. We don't do an episode. Hell, sometimes we're lucky if we do an episode a month right now because we're so busy. But I think that's just the nature of when your life takes precedence over talking about elf games or vampire games in this case. That's roleplay.
How often do you play or run any RPG then, Chris?
If I'm not streaming something, if I'm not doing a stream, I try to run something at least every 2 weeks if I can, because every week used to be. I mean, every week was good when meeting in person, but that's got progressively harder as everyone has grown up. Because
being an adult sucks.
And then if I'm streaming, then I try to every 2 weeks with streaming, and every 2 weeks if I'm doing my own game, my own home game. So, and that's just because also, like, if I'm not streaming or if I'm not running a game, I'm likely either writing material for games or podcasting about games, or I'm using the other hours I've got to paint toy soldiers and play war games. So it's you kind of just have to do a bit of project management with it.
It's nice. It's nice to be busy though. I get that, like having that sort of like knowing what you enjoy, and that your spare time is all about it as well. I think like you said, we grow up, we become adults, and you can't do it as much. But actually, if you enjoy it, so what? Like I feel like I was talking to someone recently, probably was my mother, and talking to her about like how actually these things that we got bullied for or uncool things we did at school has obviously now had a renaissance and is now really, really cool again. And
it's so much cooler apparently now.
I know. And
you've got Critical Role's got a cartoon series coming out. You've got Hollywood actors are basically role-playing all the time in their spare hours. It's I don't know how entirely cool it is now, but I mean it's definitely more acceptable to a certain extent. Definitely. I know there's a bit of pushback though. It's a weird thing, isn't it? It's like there's a pushback because also you've got the people who you would say who feel they suffered through the hobby, with their hobby all those years, and now it's suddenly cool, and they're just like, oh, that's all well and good, but like that doesn't make me feel better about the bullying and ostracization that I had through that, which is why you get that pushback of like, the whole, oh, you're just a hipster gamer, which I think is a quote from whichever kickstarted movie thing, whichever was about role-playing.
I vaguely remember that.
Yeah.
I think I saw that. Yeah. Like for me, when I've only recently, in quotation marks, I only got into role-playing games in the last 5 years.
Wow, okay.
I know, right, exactly. I know Chris is like, what? But I knew it's one of those things as not attention-seeking kids who like drama would have absolutely excelled at this, 15 years ago or whatever. It wasn't as easily available, but also just like it wasn't cool, or it just like I remember being like not publicly shamed, but sort of like, oh, you like Doctor Who? Oh, and this is when Doctor Who was coming back out, and I was like, it's pretty cool. Like it's on BBC Prime time, so all those sort of things. I think it's interesting now, it's just going back to that idea of like doing it in our spare time, because actually I think we're more rounded human beings by doing these sort of things like role playing and stuff like that. I think I have better social skills at work as a result for playing a vampire in my spare time.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot you can learn from it. I mean, my parents initially were a bit hesitant about wargaming, because obviously Games Workshop stuff was back then considered expensive, but I mean,
sure, okay, I see.
You actually, it's quite funny. You do the maths on it and you look at things, and it's like, apparently, if you take into account inflation, some of the metal miniatures back then, if you were to buy, like, you go, I want an entire 20-man Skaven unit of poison globadiers or something stupid like that, or plague monks. If you went by the classic metal miniatures that came out and were available in like 1990, oh god, when would it be? 1997, I think. It would have cost you more then than it does now to have that unit, which it's interesting. And then with like, there's other things. I was looking at something else, and it's like, oh yeah, you could get that same amount of models back then in metal costs actually more than it does now, which just says something about technology and plastic. And their attitude had to change over time because they clearly saw me and my mates doing this, and it's like, well, actually, where are they on a weekend? Like, they're spending 3-4 hours playing Necromunda campaigns on the dining room table, using the dining room table and a whole bunch of polystyrene terrain they've cobbled together, not other things. And consoles are not cheap even now, like, and that's not changing because of the chip shortage and so forth. So they accepted it, and then I think since then, obviously, since I got into like podcasting and then into writing, it's become more and more of even more of an acceptance of it. And I think it's, as you say, it's clear there's transferable skills that we talk about in academia. It's amazing. Like, podcasting when you first start out is a little scary, and then you start like getting guests on who are like, you think are like properly like your icons, like interviewing for me, like Andy Chambers and Justin Achille and Thomas Pernan and so forth have been highlights. And that's it's because you're asking about the stuff they designed, but you're also like, but I love your games.
You're really cool.
And I'm also trying to say something profound about them.
Never.
Which is hard.
Podcasting has been very interesting for me because obviously if you just reach out going, I played your RPG system on my podcast, can I interview about it? Usually they're like, you played my game? Hooray!
They're usually really forthcoming because they don't consider themselves actually that cool. Like the idea of rockstar game designers is such a joke. I mean...
Could you imagine?
I mean, that's the common joke is like back in the day when White Wolf was almost at its apex, and like we're holding like parties at Gen Con, and that was like, oh, White Wolf, they're rolling in it. They clearly got hookers and blow kind of deal going on as well. It's like such nonsense. Everyone's like pathetic nerds behind it all.
We're all just hiding behind these sort of role playing facades, you know. But speaking of writing, then, so yeah, you write quite a lot. Then you write your own scenarios and stuff like that. So how did you get into doing that?
I think that started in, like, obviously, if you're running games, you write a lot of content down, and it's when I think it was mainly for when I got into what was at the time New World of Darkness, so Vampire the Requiem and all those came out. I was like, okay, I'm gonna like write my own proper setting for this and think about it hard. And so I just built up notes, and then I dabbled at like, well, I could turn this into my own homebrew thing and use the layouts and extract those, the backgrounds from the PDF and make my own thing in Word, which is really hard. Word back then, we're talking Word circa 2010, was not great for this kind of document. And so that was like, you know, I think you can still find online, it's like, that was about 50 odd pages I wrote with a whole bunch of NPCs and so forth. And then I wrote a setting book for Venice for Changeling the Lost, which was perhaps my first stab at like a proper laid out book, which is like, again, another 120 odd pages that I wrote.
Wow.
And that took a lot of time to work through and research what I wanted to do. And from that and playing other games and doing wargaming, my first kind of actual official game writing was actually for a war game. So at the time, Red Brick Publishing had the license for Fading Suns, which is a sci-fi game, kind of Dune-esque roleplay game, and that also was by former White Wolf writers like Bill Bridges and so forth. And I got asked to work on and design the third edition of the spaceship combat game called Noble Armada. So I co-designed that.
Amazing.
And photographed miniatures I painted for it and terrain and everything. So, and writing, you know, fluff fiction, introductory like text. And that's really good because, I mean, writing rules is technical writing. And I think sometimes that's not either it's not appreciated or it's not, or people take the wrong approach to writing rules. And I like rules that are to the point and clear. Yeah. I like things that call out, like, this is you are exhausted. Exhausted is capitalized, or it's like in italics, or it's bold. Not, oh, you're exhausted, and the thing carries on. You're like, hold on a minute. Do you mean exhausted in a kind of like, you're exhausted, but there's no rules to it, or you're exhausted, there are rules to it, and that informs how I both like. And I think that's because also I don't have time to read like I don't read rule books like they're a freaking novel. Like, they're textbooks.
Yeah.
They're textbooks and should be, I feel, approached in that way. There's a time and a place to write content that's you try to inject mood. So that's where I started. And then with the Storyteller's Vault, with community content, that's where I took that Venice book and I was like, okay, let's use the templates, let's use the resources, learn Adobe InDesign, redo the layout. Oh god, it's so much easier and looks much better.
Yep.
Tidy it up, get some original artwork in there, some photography, thanks to my partner, and then put it out there. And it's basically kind of considered the Venice sourcebook for Changeling the Lost, which is great. And then since then, and through the podcast, we've done a few more. So we've also always, through the podcast, actually, we did do some fan content called Forgotten Lore, and that's essentially now what we've done again, but officially through the Storyteller's Vault. So we have like the secret frequency files. So that's like those segments we do on the show where we go real world lore, how do we use it in the games? Now we've taken a few of those examples and written them down with rules and everything. So
cool.
That's where it started, and it's just, finding the time to do projects, because the moment you do good projects on community content, then people come along and go, will you write for us? And that's interesting, because I applied to write for Onyx Path a few times, and I didn't get through on it, because I get tons of applications and tons of people who are better at writing at the time. And then if you have community content and it's selling well, that's like you've demonstrated you can do it. And that's how you get your ins into the industry. I mean, there's a part of it is also like the podcast gives you some,
like a
platform, some cachet,
really.
a platform.
Yeah.
You know what you're talking about with games. You're on the same kind of page with the designers. I've also done videos for with On Tabletop or Beasts of War back in the day. So that was like for Kingdom Death, because I was like the only person I knew through game media, thanks to the podcast, that had a fully painted core game of Kingdom Death locally. And by local, we mean in the UK, and they're based in Northern Ireland. So and those are intense weeks of like 3 days of recording 5 videos, each one a 3-hour stint of playing Kingdom Death. And it's just like hard. That was really hard.
I can imagine.
So that's the inroads into it. I think if anyone was wanting to do it, is try your hand at community content. It's just write what you like initially. Like write what you enjoy doing, and then after you feel like okay, people will buy it, then you can maybe think more about a particular niche within that product range, because everyone's got their view on, like, I don't know, if we're talking D&D, DM's Guild must have like 20 dozen stabs at a particular character class or all their own take on it, because everyone's got an opinion. That's how I've got in. And then since then it's like writing for Cubicle 7 on all 3 of the Warhammer RPGs, and working for Onyx Path on Vampire 5th edition, and currently on Changeling the Lost, and now Iron Kingdoms with Privateer Press, which is a weird one. I say weird, I really love the setting. It's a weird one because, do I be honest here, like, I did not touch D&D 5e until I got asked to write for it, to write for Iron Kingdoms. Which is, I don't know what that says about my writing, but so far, from what I know, everything's okay.
Well, I'm sure they wouldn't have asked you otherwise.
That's something, actually, you will get to a point in writing where someone thinks you can write for them, even if you don't know the game line very well. And that's a sign that they know you will put the work in to do the research.
Once you're sort of in there, if they want your kind of story, the mechanics doesn't matter. You could write agnostic story, and then people can just change it. And it's interesting what you say about DM's Guild. They've got a big Feywild stuff at the moment, and everything is Feywild.
Right.
And you're just like, okay, we get it. Fairies are in just now. Brilliant. Anything else? It's Halloween, guys. Let's try and get some spooky stuff. let's go on to then Iron Kingdoms, because obviously that's sort of what you're here to talk about. So for the uninitiated, what is Iron Kingdoms?
Oh, right, okay. So Iron Kingdoms, I believe, was the first third-party campaign that came out for the D20 system open game license. So it goes back to, I want to say 2003. I might be wrong on that. Maybe 2002. So it's old in that respect. So yeah, it's originally a D&D setting. It's also a war game. So Iron Kingdoms is renowned for the War Machine and Hordes war games. And this is a setting which I guess its main feature is it's a setting in which there is magical steam power. So I'm not going to quite say steampunk because it's got things that set it apart from that, but they've got steam power that enables magic and vice versa. So there are some human kingdoms like Signar, Kador, and Lael and Ord, and it's a civilization. These kingdoms, they emerged after that part of the world was invaded by the Orgoth, who were basically these demon worshipping nut jobs. The humans basically got the gift of magic, so they weren't able to do spellcasting before. All they could do was like divine intervention with priests. And magic, they learnt magic, and they also combined it with their steam technology to create warjacks, which are these like magical automata. So they do have a rudimentary kind of intelligence as well. And so you've got this setting where you've got these walking magical robots basically, and you've got a type of wizard called warcasters who can like bind themselves to their warjacks. There's warlocks that can do it to war beasts and control them, and yeah, they overthrew the Orgoth, and then they've got the warring kingdoms, and there's a whole plot line that goes on. And the original campaign was the Witchfire trilogy, which introduced the character of Alexia Cianor, who is basically, I don't want to do spoilers on her, but I do, as a character, I really like her because she is a sympathetic kind of villain, and ultimately, within the Iron Kingdoms where we're up to, becomes one of its heroes, even though she does necromancy. Because the Iron Kingdoms is quite interesting from other perspectives. So there's an industrial revolution powered by magic going on, there's firearms, there's gun mages who do spells through their guns, there's necrotech, there's necromancy combined with steam power, there's some weird fey-like creatures called the Grimkin. It's a genre mashup, and where I think, if I was to make comparisons, where Warhammer, classic Warhammer Fantasy, is very much like Middle Ages Renaissance meets fantasy, Iron Kingdoms to me feels more like Napoleonic era meets fantasy, because you've got like, trench warfare going on and everything. So you had the original Iron Kingdom setting for D20, then they brought out an Iron Kingdoms second edition RPG that used the same system as the war game, which I quite enjoyed, and the books are still relevant actually. There's a lot of good setting material in there, and I think that allowed them to really take a lot of the work they'd done in the war game and condense it into these books, whereas like you could tell in the original D20 books they were still exploring the setting. What we now have, the previous Kickstarter, which was, I guess, earlier this year, was
last year or something.
Yeah, last year. There we go. So we had Iron Kingdoms Requiem. So this is now Iron Kingdoms for D&D 5e, which introduces a bunch of new classes and new ancestry, species, race. So you've got your trollkin, you've got your ogrin, you've got the Iron Kingdoms take on elves and dwarves because they're not like your Tolkien tropes. And now we're on to the new one, which is one I've been writing for, which is Borderlands and Beyond, which is basically, let's go beyond the Iron Kingdoms. Let's go to the edges of society. Let's go into the wilderness. So you're going into the woodlands where the trollkin like to hang out, and the druids, where there's obviously giant troll war beasts, or go into the woods. I don't know why people would, into the haunted forests of Eos, which is where the Ios and elves are from, and there's a whole lot of shit going down with those elves. It's twisted and interesting. And then on to the Bloodstone Marches, which is basically this like desert land, which is, you could basically go as like your sandbox, literally, for adventures, because, you know, the Scorn, who are this empire of crazy, I can't even, the Scorn are like this weird, like, slaver, like, race that have war beasts and weird magic based upon, like, pain. They've been driven out of the Iron Kingdoms, and so this area is now free reign. You've got the retribution of the retribution of Syra, who are like this mercenary force. Well, not mercenary. They're like a paramilitary force of the Ios and elves. They've fallen apart and they're camped out there. You've got the trolls, and some of the villages and towns there are very Western style. So like, you know, rooting tooting cowboys, and yeah, you'll get trollkin walking around in Stetsons with 6-shooters and so forth.
That's all I want.
It's a full genre mashup.
Yeah, like you said, it's very detailed as well. Like, just looking at it briefly, like you said, you've got all these different classes, all these different takes on it, and this idea of that it is high fantasy still, but with that sort of, again, Steam-esque magic, but not steampunk. And I think it's like, when you look at certainly the images of it and the artist work, yeah, it's definitely not like we're in the future. You said that sort of Napoleonic sort of thing. It definitely looks like, and it makes me feel like, oh, actually, that's quite a cool. Because I think that's the problem sometimes when we say stuff like steampunk, or, you know, to do with that sort of engineering or mechanical element of these settings, you instantly go, oh right, so it's the future, or it's Victoriana, that sort of thing. And you're like, well, no, because we've got trollkin, we've got you know. So I think it's just really interesting as a result. Like I've never really experienced anything like it.
You can run in that game a lot of things. Like you could be a mercenary group, you could be a bunch of witch hunters working for the Order of Illumination, you can be explorers uncovering like lost ruins in the Thornwoods where the Orgoth had a part of their kingdom, or no, actually, was it the Orgoth, or there was another kingdom there as well? I forget now. I think it's the Mulgar. You could be pirates, you could be simple merchants, you could be in the city of Corvus, which is my favourite location in the entire Iron Kingdoms, and be investigators. So while it is D&D 5e, the setting is not for dungeon crawling. It's punctuated by combat, by scenes of violence in amongst the tangible reality that it is. And I think there's other things that are interesting that set it apart from other fantasy settings, and why the steampunk kind of element is important, because the Requiem core also makes some important points about what magic is like in the setting. So you can't bring people back from the dead, like, easily, if ever. Like, that is, the gods do that. So if a character dies in the course of fighting, you're done. So there's none of that. What's the spell? What was it? It's resurrection or whatever.
Resurrection, spare the dying, all that sort of thing.
Can't do that.
When you're dead, you're dead. I see.
There's no journeying astral planes. None of that. Healing spells are pretty much non-existent.
Cool.
If you do have them, healing using magic is painful. So the whole point is that magic is not like writing with a pen. It's like trying to sign your signature on a letter, but your actual tools to do it are a bloody stake and a hammer. It's like magic is brute force. So that means Mechanica, like steam, the machinery that channels magic, is what allows you to take this raw power and give it to the masses to be used in routine, mundane ways. So, you know, you might have someone who's a researcher, they have no ability with magic, and they've got a little condenser, which is like it's got like metal foil plates, and they're spinning round because it's like siphoning ambient magic, and it's using that to power, I don't know, like a magic lantern show or something. It's that kind of, that's the interaction with magic. Magic is brute force and blunt. And it's a hard, I was gonna say it's that danger element and like hard thing, and I think that's a really cool distinction away from D&D, because again there's that sort of idea like, oh well, magic is everywhere, but compared to say dungeon classic crawl
or crawl classic, or I can never remember how you say it, where it's like, yeah, magic, you can use it, but it's a last resort and it's dangerous and you could die. So having it between those sort of things, and like it's a part of life, but though it's that sort of like interesting, unknowable element of it, I think that's pretty cool. I quite like that. For you, Chris, then, is there a particular element of Iron Kingdoms with the new Kickstarter and everything? Is there one that you're like, oh, I really like this? This is a really cool thing that people should get into in Iron Kingdoms? Or a favourite bit of it you're like, oh, people should know more about this?
I mean, I personally, I'm waiting for... Well, I've enjoyed looking... Yeah, I enjoy the fact that we get to examine the Kingdom of Eos, because Ios and elves are very different to D&D Tolkien-esque elves, because elves in Iron Kingdoms are not the oldest race, and they have been monumentally screwed over like a lot in this setting. So you know that classic thing where you go, oh, I am what's his name? I am Hugo Weaving. No.
Elrond.
I'm Elrond, right? And I'm this ancient elf, and I'm so wise and everything. No. Iosans are like this bitter, really, I find really interesting, because I like this bitter elven race, because they used to exist in a way that they had no disease, they were long-lived, and then something changed with their gods, and now they're suffering mortality, and they're so desperate to find the solution for that. And they blamed humanity and the fact that humanity had magic. They thought that was the reason for it. Their gods are dying, or have gone missing, or are asleep. And the fact we're getting to really delve into them and their kingdom, so that they've not really been looked at in a lot of detail within the previous editions. And that's just really fun and interesting to look at. I'm really excited because actually one of my favourite things, I'm personally not written anything on this part of the Kickstarter, and I'm kind of like, oh, I wish I was, though. It's like, so there's a scenario, I think it's a scenario campaign coming out, which is one of the books. So like there's 3 books in this Kickstarter. So there's Borderlands and Beyond, which has got some new ancestries, new careers, new archetypes, whatever, and then new backgrounds and subclasses. Then there's Borderlands Survival Guide, which, if I'm right, is like optional rules to like for wilderness survival and creatures and why the wilderness is a bad place.
Yeah.
And then there's a campaign book called Shadow of the Seeker, so that's dealing with the Iosans. And then the thing that I really like and I'm really keen to run. I'm super keen to run this, so I want to see it.
Yeah.
When I can see it, like I'm bugging Matt Getz, who's in charge of developing. I'm going to have to bug him so I can read it early. Is Escape the Mindslavers, because this is another faction called the Cephalex, who are a humanoid race, but they... See how I said, like, humans have warjacks, these automata, right, that are powered by magic, and then warlocks come from the wilderness. They're trollkin, or the Scorn, or they're the Legion of Everblight, or they're the Circle of Orborous Druids, and they use magic and they bind with war beasts, and they learn natural magical ability in the war beasts. The Cephalics are like the just totally weird by comparison. So they are psionics. So they don't use magic. They have bulbous brains covered in mechanica and stuff. Yeah. So they've got these appendages that are very Doc Ock kind of style. They have slaves who they've lobotomized or they grow or whatever, and again are under their control. And then they have these abomination type creatures, which are warjack style like people, kind of, who they've like cut the arms off and grafted on like horrific, like, circular saws and so forth, and they control them with their minds. And the Cephalics like live underground and are from a part of the Amoran and have come all the way through to Western Amoran where the Iron Kingdoms are. And I just love these crazy bastards. The image of them on the Kickstarter, I'm like, ooh, that's the sort of thing I want to terrify my players with. They're gruesome. Creepy.
Yeah, like you said, like almost this it looks a bit like a sort of a beholder stuck on a body, but with way too many sharp arms.
Their body's floating there. They levitate with their psychic abilities because their body is like an emaciated, useless piece of flesh. So I'm looking forward to seeing that book. But yeah, Iozans have been really interesting. And it's also been fun to write about trollkin. I love trollkin.
Yeah, I like trollkins.
they're good fun.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, like, we still, even with this, we don't tap all the wilderness or bits that people associate with Hordes. So Hordes has got the Scorn, as I said. You've got the Legion of Everblight to the north, which are like, I can't even begin. They're like body horror meets dragons. So like the blood of dragons causes like this blight which can mutate flesh and create these what called dragon spawn. So they're another thing entirely. We still haven't even had a book yet in this version or the previous version for the Kingdom of Crix, which is the kingdom of the undead, and they have a dragon, the lord of all dragons, called Toruk. So dragons again in this setting are not like dragons we know. They're kind of like gods and kind of like not, and they're kind of alien to the world of Amoran, and it's they're
a different interpretation of the sort of the good metallics and chromatics.
And I think that's the thing, is that Iron Kingdoms does give fresh approach to D&D with how you run your games, because as I said, the kingdoms have got such a violent weaponry that running a dungeon crawler makes no sense. Like when you might be fighting mercenary forces armed with repeater rifles or have mortars and explosives, along with magic and giant warjacks. It's you have to. I think it's how you adventure in this world is very different.
Yeah.
And of course, it all runs off the SRD, so all the traditional classes and traditional stuff works. There's just a few fixes to make it more Iron Kingdom. So what is Iron Kingdoms introduces essences and background. So normally you can do the normal build where you build your character, you pick their race, ancestry, and that sets your bonuses to your stats.
So, yes, for certain ones, yeah.
If you go the Iron Kingdom's Requiem route, that doesn't come from your species, from your ancestry. Instead, you choose also on top your essence and background, and they tell you where to put things. So if you go, I'm an Ogren, but I'm actually quite intelligent, so I actually get a bonus to my wisdom rather than to my strength, because an Ogren is basically a big ogre-like person. Or if you're like if you play a Gobber, which is a goblin, well, are you sneaky, or are you actually the random, quite strong goblin? For whatever reason, you've actually got a bonus to your strength attribute. So there's that in there. I think magic as well with clerics. You've got different domains as well. So are you a cleric to Morrow? Are you a cleric, or I say cleric? Are you a left-handed path cleric to Thamar, who is Morrow's dark sister? Are you a priest to Menoth? So there's plenty of gods and everything to interact with. And then, of course, I'm one of the stretch goals.
Yes, which is so exciting.
Which is exciting and a bit terrifying. So if we reach $380,000 on this, I will be writing a further scenario for Iron Kingdoms, which is crazy. I don't know what to say to that. I mean, the reason why Matt picked me up to write on this was because I was streaming Iron Kingdoms, the previous edition.
Yes, that's right, on Darker Days. Yeah.
And that was a good laugh. And it was just like, I guess it just proved that you get the setting, you know about it.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah, because it's that sort of thing where I think if you know the subject matter well and you know how to, like you said, like because you said before, like when you're creating your own sort of you're always home brewing stuff anyway, and just I think nowadays, like you said, with podcasting, with being able to stream like a Zoom call, people can actually see what you're doing very easily. It's so easy to build up like a portfolio of stuff, whereas obviously, like you were saying before, times when we're like, it's on the forum, it's in a PDF, it's hidden away somewhere, like all your sort of writing stuff, whereas actually, getting a show reel together now of all your stuff is pretty straightforward. So that's incredible that you just doing Iron Kingdoms and suddenly they reach out to you, go, hey, next
I would
Kickstarter.
caveat it with, like, I don't think I would have been confident writing for it if I hadn't done some actual writing for
True, yeah, you've been writing, yeah, exactly.
Because I think just because you stream because streaming games and preparing your own games and writing things, like if we consider like what we're doing for Vampire the Masquerade, like my notes for our vampire games are like, is a page of A4 thereabouts.
Possibly a little less when me and Ben are involved.
But it's but that's the thing, is like that's fine for your own games, and if you're very good at like spontaneously running things. But I think when it comes to writing, my only advice is just to keep going at it and keep writing, because you're only going to get more practice by writing. I think that comes in like two halves, because the other thing is I don't just... Obviously, my day job currently, anyway, and is research. So I don't just write games. I'm not going to make a life out of... I'm not going to pay a mortgage on games currently. That's for certain.
Sadly, yeah.
But I also write, research, like as in I have published research.
Yeah.
So I think that means you're at least aware of how to write good English. Yeah, you should be. Even though I would say some academics still can't.
That's a different podcast in itself, Chris, and you know it.
But also I think it informs you on like technical writing to like for writing rules and getting across rule systems. Because also like my day job is like computer programming, and again that is, to me, the difference between these things is very little. It's structure. And then the other thing I write is like outreach material. Well, I say outreach, but it's for a magazine called Cyber, which is a futurism and science magazine. So again, that's trying to like take something I know quite well that is quite detailed, but explain it to a general audience. And so I think in some respects that's kind of what you're doing with roleplay games. It's like, the setting, but you need to get that through to people. Like, the hooks, and you need to get it through to them, where the rules and you need to lay it out. So really my advice is just to practice and have other people read your stuff. Also, this is a huge thing if you want to go down this route, is spell check. There's no excuse these days. Like, you can write, and also you could use like Google Docs to write your material.
Yep, that's what I do.
And you can use Grammarly for free to do a lot of good editing. Yeah. And find out whether you're using too much passive speaking. I'm always bad for that on a first draft, because I'm just trying to get the ideas out first before I go back and like change the tense up.
Grammarly has saved several emails to people. When you're writing then a scenario, or where do you start? Do you start with the idea, like the outline, or do you start with like an ending, or like what's just the process?
God. So I would say for a scenario, I always have in mind that there should be a structure of key scenes, and I try to work out where I want to go first. Like, what is the end goal? What am I trying to set up that's exciting? And then how do I start is then the next thought. Like, where are they coming from? Why? And therefore that's like, why is going from there to there going to be exciting? Like, what's the big change that's going to occur for them? And then if I have that in mind, I'll have an idea for what the middle should be. There should be somewhere you definitely want to go through, which means you can ramp up the tension from. So that ramping up will either be you get there and you realise things are much more complicated than you initially thought, or you're halfway there in the story and there's the turnover, like things were not as expected, allies are enemies, enemies are allies, etc., etc. So that's generally the structure I go for, and then filling the other scenes around it, depending upon the length of them. With the knowledge that, if you're doing pre-written scenarios, especially with where you've got a limit on word length, it's going to be a little railroady, and
of course
that's to be expected. So I try to write with some utility of the scenes, so that it should be clear. If you want to move a scene and translate it in the order of the scenes, you should be able to do that. Or if you could lift up and do the same story but in a different place, you could generally get away with that. Or offer advice on where, like, okay, this entire segment you're finding quite exciting. Insert more scenes, do some more stuff, because the thing is, and this is something I've learned a lot, and I've always heard when people go, "Oh, we were running this game, and then I TPK'd the entire lot," and I was like, that's not like.
That's not, yeah.
I like when you're time poor, as we are now,
Yes.
and also you've got so many distractions, like with gaming, then often it's not about if you make the end, if you get there, and we see this with computer games actually. It's not if you get there, it's the quality of the ending that you get. So I'm less about, like, I understand when I write a scenario, you will reach the end. I want the players, I want the GM to reach the end. How good an ending they get based upon the choices along the way, I think is more interesting. So, for example, like within Chronicles of Darkness scenario that I wrote called The Hunger Within, that's a folk horror scenario that's based in my hometown.
Right from the heart, yeah.
Yeah, right from the heart. But so the whole point of that is they can reach the end, but there's a few choices they can make at the end that relies upon whether they got certain clues or made certain insights along the way that, based upon that, they can get the good end or the really sucky end or something in between. And you see that, I guess the one game that really sold that to me about you reach that point is the Silent Hill games.
I was going to say, yeah, Silent Hill
is very much like that.
Yeah.
So that's my approach. That's my thought process on writing scenarios to be sold to people.
Because loads of games do that, like The Walking Dead, where you make choices, and at the end they always show you at the end, go, how many people who played through the scenario got this and stuff. And I love that idea that you have good, bad, worse endings or flavors of in between, almost like Undertale in a way. I think that's a really cool thing, because you always have players who always go, so what did we miss? Which is, as a GM, you're like, just be in the moment.
I've heard this in relation to the scenario I wrote. I designed and then co-wrote with David Whitworth, who also does Darkhammer with us and streams. So I designed Hell Rides to Help for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay for a Halloween game now 3 years ago. Yeah, God. And then he came. He ran it as well on that same day, and so we were able to play test it with different groups of players, and then we pitched it and co-wrote it and tidied up the notes and everything into actual prose and everything.
Yeah.
But I've heard from people that have played it that they've had the same group of players, once they've played through it, the same group of players go, can we play it again with different characters?
How interesting.
Because we know we've missed things. There are things we've missed, and we want to know what we could have missed. And I thought, that's... Like, I know the way it was set up is they're not going to get everything. They're not going to learn all the secrets. There's just no way, because that game is designed to be run as a one-shot for a demo event. So it's meant to, like, the players have no time to breathe. There's no time for shopping. I hate shopping in games, like, where it means nothing.
What?
So they don't have time to do that. But the idea then that because it's played that way, that players want to go, can we play it again because we've missed something, is really interesting. And I don't know, I guess that's a really high praise for it. And I think I think something I've been quite proud of to hear. And I think people said the same about other scenarios that I've written, so...
Yeah. Actually, that's a very good point, because I feel like when we play RPGs or one-shots, or when you get scenarios and stuff, very rarely do we go, oh, we want to play that again. And similar to some video games as well, like sometimes you might play it through again to get all the achievements. I don't think I've ever done that. As a player, obviously I've run the same scenario for other groups of players, but I've never thought to myself, oh, I'd love to play that again with the almost like a roguelike it in a way.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I hadn't really thought of that. Having a scenario whereby you could play it over and over again, almost Deathloop style, and get through it.
It's interesting, that approach, because the moment you get into that mindset about being able to revisit a setting for a game to get more out of it, that changes you from how you approach designing scenarios or content or a setting for a game. Because, for example, and I think this is really interesting, it's often been one of the complaints, like for Wrath and Glory, that I hear, and grates me, because I wrote on the core game for that and other things, is that people look at Wrath and Glory as a Warhammer 40,000 game and go, oh, but it's just Super Friends. Like, why is a Space Marine teaming up with this, and this, all these character archetypes? And because they think, oh, but that's meant you're playing a campaign, aren't you? So how are these really weird combinations of characters going to stick together? And you're like, well, no, because if you look at the novels and you look at any interesting media, it's always like an event occurs and disparate groups of people are thrust together for that one moment, and then after that, it's gone. And what I think is really cool is there's been a recent series of scenarios out for Wrath and Glory called Litanies of the Lost, which actually takes place in the same event, but you play it with each scenario is from a different angle of the event occurring. So scenario 1, you're just tier 1 Imperial Guardsmen, you're grunts, you're going to die horrific deaths, dealing with horrors of chaos. Tier 2, it's the same world, it's the same events going on, but you're going to interact with events slightly differently because you're tier 2 characters, so you're more capable. Tier 3, you're now playing Space Marines, who have a completely different view on what's going on. The horrors that you were facing in tier 1 are now, you're going to massacre in tier 3. And that changes. I think that's more similar to like Nordic LARP as well, in the sense that you're playing in that one moment. You're not playing an entire campaign where you're worried about, is my character going to survive? Am I going to get enough XP points to go on to the next adventure? And I think that's where then the idea of replaying a scenario or a setting becomes interesting, because you're like, could that have been done better? Could we have learned something different? Or will we learn something different from the setting if we play these higher tier characters or lower tier characters? Because they have different... Like a Space Marine is not going to be able to walk around the Underhive very easily, whereas like a poor ganger can do so.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of any other scenarios like D&D related. Like, the only one I can think of that's replayed several times and famously is awful is Tomb of Horrors, which is deliberately meant to be like your characters get grinded up because it's that bad. But actually having a scenario like that, it is about the story. It's about how do you get to, it's about the choices you make giving you that level of ending. It's obviously much more interesting than just like throwing stats as a challenge and then knocking it down till you proceed to the next area. So I guess just to sort of finish it off, Chris, is there anything, obviously we're going to plug the Kickstarter, I know, but is there anything else you wish to plug, or what people are up to and stuff?
On the Storyteller Vault release just recently is, so Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition is now an option on Storyteller's Vault, so people can go over there and publish their own their community content on there. So there are 2 scenarios on there from myself and the Dark Days team. So there is Ascension Night, which was the first ever recorded play of Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition, and therefore the first ever written scenario for it that we ran on release day. So you can actually listen to that podcast episode as well as playing through the scenario. Then the other scenario is Make Blood Boil, which I've run for demos and of course has been out in the wild for ages. And of course, Fiona, you've played through.
I played it. It's great fun.
So those scenarios are basically taking what we initially put out for free and hosted on the website, on the Dark Days Radio website, and now have been like redressed up in the true form, in the Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition format, with all the files and everything they give you to do that. So those are doing rather well. They are pay what you want, so pay what you want. Like, you don't have to pay.
But actually pay.
They're cheap. They're like £3.
Yeah,
so,
exactly. It's nothing. Really.
And they've also got like,
and they're really well written.
They've also got setting material in there, so you can set your games in Manchester if you wanted to, because that's my setting for it. Obviously, there is Dark Days Radio and Dark Hammer, which Dark Days Radio is a horror podcast focusing a lot on World of Darkness and Chronicles of Darkness. That's been going on for literally ages. There are hundreds of episodes, interviews with people, and games mastering guidance and original content. Darkhammer, which I really need to record a new episode of at some point.
You're a very busy man. It's okay, Chris.
Is all about the Warhammer RPG. So we look at a different concept in it and how to roleplay as that. So I think we talked about in one episode about why playing a Space Marine is actually interesting. And how you do it. Like, they're a fish out of water if you put them with regular humans, because they're basically these programmed superhuman killers who are called Angels of Death. And then you're like, aren't they just basically like child soldiers that have grown up? That's effectively what they are. Obviously, there's the streamed game of Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition going on, and at some point we'll take a break from that and run something else. That'll be good. There's the Kickstarter, which is doing quite well.
Very well.
It's tracking with the original Kickstarter quite well. It's currently on $276,000.
Pretty good.
Then there's Cyber Magazine, which will be out, a new issue will be out in October. So Cyber Magazine, as I say, is a futurism, pop science, technology magazine. It's a very nice looking magazine because James, who is the editor for it, has a particular eye for graphic design and what it looks like. But we try to couple it with actual, like, properly researched science and so forth. So the next issue is about... What is the next issue about? It's about Earth. It's basically titled Earth 2070. So we're talking about a lot of green technologies and things like... what did I write for it, actually? I've written an article just now about green transport technologies, things about, like, batteries, and really getting to grips with the idea, I think, that when you hear about something that is like, oh, well, this technology is low carbon, that comes at a price, and so not every green technology is as green as you think. We are playing these balancing games always with trying to find a solution. So when someone says they've got a brand new green technology, you kind of go like, yes, but at what cost?
Yes, hang on.
So yeah, for the magazine, I'm the senior writer, so I write at least one or two articles every issue.
Nice. And when's that out?
Oh, I don't have a date. It's likely going to be. It's likely going to be towards the end of this month, or
end of October.
Or November. Yeah, just because of where I have to fill gaps sometimes in writing. That happens.
Yep. It sounds like a breeze, really, all the stuff you're doing. You make it look so easy and effortless, Chris, as well as painting your house.
It's painful, and painting toy soldiers when I get the chance to
de-stress, probably, and not look at a screen.
It's a wonderful de-stress, it is. Yeah, so that's basically it. Just, if people are into D&D, pick up Iron Kingdoms. Actually, people should have found, if they've got it, there was a free RPG Day Iron Kingdoms scenario. So all you need to run that is the SRD and the pre-generated characters that are online for D&D.
Perfect. And well, I'll just finish off by saying I'm the host of What Am I Rolling, a twice-monthly RPG one-shot podcast. As always, it's going very, very well. We have Vert coming out on Halloween and the 2 weeks after Halloween, run by Rob, who you know and you've interviewed recently. So
yeah, I've never played Vert.
It uses the Cypher system, which is very, very good and very easy. And Rob was excellent running it, and obviously set in Manchester, so it's brilliant. Really, really enjoyable. And at some point there'll be more stuff after that coming out. We have an offer code for Third Space Gaming, which is your local friendly game store in Burnley, where I'm originally from. So if you put in the offer code DMBC into checkout, you get 10% off, and that can be on anything. That could be an RPG book. That could be, well, maybe they'll stock Iron Kingdoms. Who knows? They'll definitely have terrain and war stuff. So that's off your first order. And of course, we are now streaming exclusively season 3 of DM's Book Club on Dragon Duel's Twitch channel, which is very exciting. Myself and my new co-host Hamilton. By the time this comes out, the next episode will be on the long-awaited arrival of season 3 for Critical Role, where we just talk about the source books that have come out, which are very interesting, and how you can make your own stuff for that, but also catching up on the stuff that has been released as well in the intervening time. So all that's very exciting. And just to say, thank you so much, Chris, for this very last minute interview. I appreciate it's like
That's
you are
all right.
a busy man getting stuff done. So this is exciting, and well, I hope, fingers crossed, that your stretch goal gets funded, so you get even more work.
I do hope it gets picked up. That'll be great. But
I'm sure.
yeah, if it doesn't, I'm sure I don't know. Maybe I'll get asked to write it anyway. These things always happen.
I think you will, but
Yeah.
maybe you'll take that time off to do even more painting of miniatures, perhaps.
Yes, that's for certain.
Well, with all that, friends, thank you so much for listening, and we'll speak to you next time. Bye.
Bye.